African infrastructure, or the lack thereof, remains a barrier for the growth of the mining industry. And the question we're asking is, how do we overcome this? To help us understand or perhaps answer this question, we are joined by Ignacio. Thank you so much for your time. So infrastructure is one of the words or concepts that comes through a lot when we're talking about the mining industry. How do we deal with the infrastructure challenges, particularly in the mining industry on the continent?
Yeah, no, it is a huge challenge. I mean, if you look at Africa, if you look, for example, at railways, Africa only represents 2% of all the railway traffic in the world. It's the continent with the least share of railway traffic. If you look at energy infrastructure, transmission lines, South Africa alone has got a target of 14,000 kilometers of additional transmission lines it wants to build in South Africa. So there are huge challenges to put that infrastructure up to where it has to be to really empower the mining industry. I think that's really where, with the current situation in terms of fiscal constraints that lots of governments are under, it's finding innovative solutions with private sector to put in that investment that is so required for infrastructure and for mining on the continent.
When it comes to that investment that is required, is the money there, or is it a case where investors are still assessing risk about the continent and various parts of it? What are the issues that are on the table that sort of prevent us from dealing with the infrastructure issue?
Yeah, I think we have to start with the positives. The positives is you have a mining industry and you have mining resources in Africa which are second to none in many cases. And that is an industry which has export revenues. And so there is a huge potential to garner that industry, that mining industry, to underpin infrastructure investments. And so really it's a question of thinking smartly about it. How can we take those export revenues and use those to underpin infrastructure? And how can we therefore mobilize private sector to invest in that infrastructure? And it's really a question of setting appropriate frameworks that provide those private investors with the right risk-reward equation. And so it's talking to governments, it's talking to private sector, it's talking to mining operators to see how do you allocate that risk and that reward in a way which is fair and smart. And if you're able to do that, the money will flow. But that's the key question. How do you allocate that risk and reward in a way which is fair, equitable, and gives investors in infrastructure that long-term visibility and assurance? But there are ways of doing it, and it has been done, and it can be done in the future.
Speaking of ways of doing it, talk to me about the role the IFC plays in alleviating that challenge as a global institution.
Yeah. So IFC, as many people know, I hope, is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. But we work very closely with our public sector arm, the World Bank, to precisely, as I was mentioning, frame or create a framework to allow private investment. So just to give a few examples, in Guinea, we were quite key in enabling the multi-user framework for rail infrastructure in Guinea for the bauxite miners in Guinea. Thanks to that effort, money flowed into the rail and port infrastructure in Guinea for that bauxite corridor, enabling the rail freight going from about 27 million tonnes per annum to over 50 million tonnes per annum. And again, that was really breaking ground in terms of taking a rail and port infrastructure which was for only one user to make it multi-user, so many bauxite miners could actually access that rail and port infrastructure and therefore enable both the bauxite industry and the broader industrial development of the country. That's just one example of how smart risk allocation and frameworks can enable investment into a country. And then we worked with our World Bank colleagues on the government side and with our private sector clients, the bauxite miners, to enable that.
You spoke about thinking smartly about some of these solutions in order to deal with the challenges. When you're having conversations at an event like this, like the Mining Indaba, what are some of the other smart solutions that people are bringing onto to the table, to the conversation that are worthy of exploration, so we can at least, see some green shoots in this challenge?
Yeah. So one other area that I haven't mentioned as much is on the power side, and really thinking of innovative solutions on the power that haven't really been thought of, at least not in a major way on the continent. So, for example, transmission infrastructure. Transmission infrastructure has typically been done by the public sector. We are very much pushing for transmission to be done through public-private partnerships or private transmission lines. For example, a couple of years ago, we signed an agreement with Npower, a company developing a 190-kilometer transmission line between Zambia and DRC, a high-voltage line, which is critical for the mining industry in DRC for security of supply of power. And so I think it's really trying to see how you can find those innovative areas, which things sometimes haven't really been done before. And this is part of a broader development challenge. So we very much believe that by developing this infrastructure, whether it's power or rail or port, for the mining industry, you're actually helping a broader development for the economy. And on the power side, for example, we have an initiative as a World Bank group with the African Development Bank called M300, Mission 300, which is to really provide power to 300 million Africans who don't currently have access to reliable, cheap power. And we think the mining industry, ironically or interestingly, could really be a catalyst to enable that infrastructure, which, whether it's transmission or other type of infrastructure, that can then allow, for example, meeting part of the goal of that M300 for the broader continent and access to power for the populations.
Building on that, if you had to imagine an idea or rather a future where we future-proof the African mining industry, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think first of all, it starts with environmental and social future-proofing. So ensuring that everything that is built and is thought of in a long-term basis from an environmental and social perspective, from a climate adaptation resilience perspective. And I think that's key. And that's why we work with operators who really understand that it's a long-term game and you have to future-proof your mine and your infrastructure for that long-term game. I think the other element is more of a social economic development. It's really thinking of mining, as I mentioned, not just as a mine and as an export of material, but really how you can, over time, it's not immediate, but over time, provide local beneficiation, local processing in country. It requires a lot of elements. It requires often reliable, cheap energy and electricity, which is not always there immediately. But over time, how do you as a mining company, how do you as a government, how do you as financiers really create that pathway to create more and more value add in country and really benefit the local economy as much as possible?
As we wrap up the conversation, you brought up the environmental and the social. Can you do both at the same time, or do you read the area, the region, the community, and the needs in terms of whether you focus on the environmental first or the social? How do you balance that?
I think both have to come absolutely hand in hand. At the end of the day, environmental is social and social is environmental. In the same way as you might be trying to protect a forest close to your mine, but if you're not looking after the community, those communities may end up by using that forest for firewood or for other purposes, and vice versa. If you're not taking care of your environment, then the local communities will suffer. So it's really a really integrated process and complex and dynamic, which changes over time from when you're exploring to when you're developing the mine and when you're operating. And I think that's the complexity of this industry, is to see how do you do that in a way which is a win-win for everybody as much as possible, and you communicate that win-win at the different levels. But that's really where we as IFC, we try to partner with our private sector clients, working with the World Bank and governments to sort of see how we can enable that.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
For more insights, you can go to miningindaba.com.